Welcome everyone to Wednesday Night at the Lab. I'm Tom Zinnan. I work here at the UW-Madison Biotechnology Center. I also work for the Division of Extension here at UW-Madison, formerly known as the Cooperative Extension folks here in Wisconsin. And on behalf of those folks and our other co-organizers, Wisconsin Public Television, the Wisconsin Alumni Association, and the UW-Madison Science Alliance, thanks again for coming to Wednesday Night at the Lab. We do this every Wednesday night, 50 times a year. Tonight, it's my great pleasure to welcome to Wednesday Night at the Lab, Kevin Walters. He was born in Columbia, Missouri, and he graduated from high school, from Temple High School in Temple, Texas. And then he went to the University of Texas at Austin for undergraduate degrees in both history and in humanities. Then he got 2 master's degrees at the University of Texas at Dallas, again, one in humanities and one in history. Then he came to UW-Madison, and he just finished up his PhD in history here at UW-Madison. He defended in 2018, but he's going to walk in 2019. And as I always say, how do you pronounce party? He's here to talk about a pretty amazing thing. The title of this talk is Before the Foundation, Harry Steenbock and the Patenting of University Science, 1886 to 1925. As someone famous from my hometown, Ronald Reagan, used to say, it's not that people don't know, it's just so much what we know just isn't so. And I think we're going to have some pretty interesting myth-busting today. And one of the most fascinating things about education isn't just learning, it's unlearning. I got to hear your talk a couple of weeks ago. There's going to be a lot of unlearning tonight. Please join me in welcoming Kevin Walters to Wednesday Night at the Lab.
Thank you. The first myth I have to bust actually is I already walked in 2018. The degree will be granted in 2019 for bureaucratic reasons. So I didn't want anybody to get their hopes up that you're going to get invited to the party because it already happened. But yes, so the degree was, I deposited on Martin Luther King Day actually. So the degree will be granted in 2019. But anyway, we're historians, we have to get our dates right. So. My title is a Strategic Research Coordinator at Wharf. I've worked at Wharf in various capacities since 2011. Strategic Research Coordinator is the corporate sounding title for the historian. We had to make it sound respectable somehow, but my job is basically a historian. And I like to start any talk I give about Wharf by asking people, how many of you have heard of Wharf? Here it is. How many of you actually know what Wharf does? Okay, so yeah. And also, this is probably the 4th time I presented in this room for different reasons. How many people have heard me talk before? Okay, a few. I'm guessing I'm getting to the point of getting repeat customers, which is always a good thing. But I try to mix up my jokes a little bit. But how many people have heard of Harry Steenbock, who's actually the subject? Okay, so about the same number. How many know what Harry Steenbock actually did? Okay, that's good. So I'm glad. Thanks for being honest. But when I talk about Wharf, I start with a story that I was once at the Discovery Building across the street here, and a woman who I believe she worked at the Chamber of Commerce asked me where I worked, and I said I work at Wharf, and she said, "Oh, the Wharf, where's that?" And I said, well, there's this big building we got down by the lake and great views of the lake. And we had a confusing conversation that went on longer than it should have. And eventually she just said, wait a minute, there's a wharf on Lake Mendota? So I have to clarify. This is wharf with an A, not with an O, not with an H. So she seemed to think I was slinging fish down in the lake, but it's not the truth. What Wharf actually is what we call a technology transfer office. Most universities have them these days. What we do is we take discoveries that have been made in the university laboratories. We file patents on the patentable items that come out of those discoveries. We license them to companies. Sometimes they're existing companies. Other times they're startups that faculty have founded themselves. We take the proceeds, the royalties that Wharf earns off of the products that are developed out of those by those companies, and we put that money into an endowment. That endowment then funds annual grants back to the university to support research. We call this a cycle of innovation. What starts at the university goes out into the public, out in the public marketplace, then it comes back to the university to support future research, so the cycle can continue. A couple things to clarify about Wharf. It is not an office on Bascom Hill. It's a separate nonprofit foundation in that building that I just showed you there. Is run by an independent board of UW alumni. In order to be a member of the board of Wharf, you either have to be the managing director, the chancellor at the university, or have gotten a degree from UW-Madison. And it's also, we only support UW-Madison. We do not support the UW system. The University of Milwaukee Research Foundation handles Milwaukee patents, and WISIS Technology Foundation handles the rest of the system. They're a sister foundation. So we only support UW-Madison, and we don't support things like Marquette. We don't support other businesses or other foundations, just a UW-Madison local office. So there's a couple things. It gives you kind of the basic overview of what WARF is and what WARF does. I also want to give you some details about Harry Steenbock, who's the subject of my talk and the subject of the dissertation that I just completed, so that we'll all be on the same page. WARF was Harry Steenbock's idea, basically. He was born in Wisconsin, raised in Wisconsin. I have his degree dates there. He got 3 degrees from the University of Wisconsin. It was just the University of Wisconsin at that time, but it was the Madison campus. This was before the creation of the system. So there wasn't a UW-Eau Claire and UW-Stevens Point. There was just the University of Wisconsin, which was in Madison. He studied under E.B. Hart, who was actually a student of Stephen Babcock, whose name you probably know. So as a graduate student, Steenbock participated in what was called the single grain ration experiment. What they did was they took 4 cows, they fed one of the cows oats, one of them corn, another one wheat, and then a 4th one they fed them a mixture of all 3 as a control. And what they did is they chemically altered these rations so that they had the same balance of fat, protein, and carbohydrate. So as you know, probably wheat has more protein than corn, but they adulterated the corn to make it have the same amount of protein as wheat, or the other way around. They balanced it out. So the idea here was that they're all eating the same grain, they're eating different grains that supposedly had the same balance of nutrition. And what happened is the cows all had different outcomes. Some of them had stillborn calves, some of them went blind, some of them got very weak. And what this demonstrated was there's something other than the macronutrients, protein, carbohydrates, and fat, that you need for animals to be healthy, animals including humans. And this was one of the foundational experiments in vitamin science. It made UW-Madison one of the centers for vitamin science, one of the centers of biochemistry. It was called agricultural chemistry at the time here. But it was one of the things that really made this campus great in terms of vitamin science. And this was Steenbock's first publication. The first article he published, actually in English, he actually published one in German as a student when he was abroad. But his first publication was the single grain ration results. And then he became a professor. And as a professor, his laboratory discovered a process to use ultraviolet light to fortify food with vitamin D in 1923. This was an outgrowth of the vitamin experiments. He filed the first patent that WARF he filed a patent on this. That patent was then assigned to WARF, and he helped with the original alumni of WARF. He helped found WARF. So WARF was his idea. That became the first invention. It ended up earning about $14 million, something around $200 million if you adjust that in for inflation. And this was WARF's the first seeds of WARF's endowment. So this is a basic overview of what Steenbock did so that you'll have a better sense of what I'm talking about. But I want to dig into this a little deeper, and I want to start, if you read the description for my talk, I described this newspaper article very briefly. So this originally appeared in the Louisville Courier Journal for reasons you can probably understand. It originated in Kentucky, but it was syndicated across the country. I think this actual version actually came from Dubuque, if I'm remembering correctly. But what they did was, so Seabiscuit, if you saw the movie a few years ago or maybe read the book, he was a Depression-era inspiration story, kind of an underdog horse who then went on to set records for earning all kinds of winnings. And when this was published in 1940, he was at the end of his career, and they wanted to place his winnings in context to see just how much is it that he'd earned $437,000, how much is that compared to other famous careers. And so, of course, they picked Babe Ruth, another famous athlete, the President of the United States, and Greta Garbo. And you can see these numbers. I pulled them out on the side so you could read them more easily. Basically, what they're saying here is that Seabiscuit won more money than the president earned during his administration. He won more money than Babe Ruth earned during his, or Babe Ruth averaged during his years as a baseball player, but he didn't earn as much as a movie star. He didn't earn as much as Greta Garbo. And then to add some balance to the piece, maybe give it some moral weight, they had to find the regular guy. And it turned out they chose Harry Steenbock, who by this time had become somewhat famous because of his irradiation process. And so they compared his winnings to Seabiscuit's. And what they found was that the humble scientist had earned less than all the rest of them here. $220,000 or about $6,800 per year. Now the problem with this is that almost everything you can read in that little box is wrong. Some of it is close enough. Some of it's basically right, and I'll kind of have a pass. Like I might quibble with it as an historian, but I'm fine with that. The part about rickets, curing rickets is pretty good. But the money is not right. I'm not actually sure where they got these numbers. The truth of it is, so here's what the Seabiscuit comparison said, $220,000. I went to the University Archives, I found Steenbock's salary records. They're on these little note cards. One of the note cards was missing, so I'm not entirely sure, I can't be entirely sure what he earned. But piecing things together, during the time of the Seabiscuit comparison, he actually earned about $150,000. Now, part of the reason for this is that he was a graduate student from 1908 to 1916, so he was earning much less than what he did as a professor. So they actually highballed the number in terms of just his salary. but that's just part of the story. His salary is actually a minority of what he actually earned as a scientist. So during the 1930s, Capital Times, the newspaper, still exists today. At the time, it was edited by a man named William Evu. If you go to the Badger football games, the Evu press box, the Evu Foundation, and is still a good charitable foundation. Locally, he's a kind of a famous name locally. But he and Wharf didn't see eye to eye on things, shall we say. Wharf didn't disclose its financial records at the time. Evu didn't like that. He was suspicious about private foundations. He believed that the university should only be taking public money. The university should be funded by taxpayer dollars and nothing else. That was his stance. And he wanted to figure out how much money Wharf was making. But they didn't disclose it. But as a professor, he could figure out, he could access Steenbock's personal income tax records. And so he used that. Evu also knew that Wharf paid its inventors 15% of net avail. So he could reverse engineer from Steenbock's earnings what Wharf was actually making. What he determined was that Wharf had paid Steenbock about $617,000 over the course of 1929 to 1938. So over the course of a decade, they paid about $600,000. This is not quite right. I have access to Wharf records, the audit reports year to year. And what the audit reports show is that over the income-earning life of Steenbock's patents, 1928 to 1945, they paid him directly $700,000 or so, a little bit more than that. This is about half of what they actually paid him, however, because you also have to account for the special research account. Around 1937, Steenbock, because of things like the Capital Times investigation, because of the attention that would ultimately lead to the Seabiscuit comparison, he got very uncomfortable with the fact that he was getting paid a lot of money. He did not patent for money. That wasn't what he got into this for, and he realized that it looked kind of bad. And he went to the trustees and he said, I'm not going to take any more of this. He actually refused to take any more money. The trustees, though, said, if you don't take the money, then no other scientist is going to give us our patents, because there's no incentive to do that. We really need you to do this. And they ended up with a compromise where they said they're going to hold on to some of his royalties. They'll keep it in a special account, and they would give that, if he wanted money for research in his laboratory, he could come to them and say, I want some money for this year for research. So this wasn't technically, so Evu's investigation didn't find this because it wasn't being paid to Steenbock, but I consider this part of Steenbock's royalties, and it was. The trustees wanted it to be, and had he gone to the trustees and said, I want all of this right now, they would have given it to him. This is money that was in Steenbock's control. So I counted together. So adding all this together, for the 20 years of the Seabiscuit comparison, Steenbock was earning in royalties and salary about $965,000, a little less than $1 million, or about $30,000 per year. During Seabiscuit's career, Steenbock earned $525,000, which is more than what Seabiscuit earned. And this is total Wharf royalties. Steenbock was paid about $1.4 million in royalties. And you'll notice I said $14 million. This is a net number, so it's after expenses. So it ended up being about 10% of the gross of the $14 million that the Steenbock patents earned. This still isn't the entire story. When Steenbock died in 1967, his estate was worth $6.3 million. This is how the State Journal reported it. You'll notice that the Cap Times was more specific, $6,313,124. This was not what Wharf had paid him. He had invested a lot of that money. It helps to have friends who run a foundation. This was his stocks and bonds, his insurance, his real estate. He actually became an art collector later in life. And this is how much of his estate was worth at the end of his life. If you adjust that for inflation, Steenbock was worth about $47 million when he died. So obviously that number is bigger than any number there on the side. Now to be fair, we also have to adjust Greta Garbo's dollars. She probably had about $80 million. And this doesn't include any investments or real estate that she may have had. But the point being, Steenbock wasn't just in the top 1% of American income earners. He was in the top 0.01%, top 100th of 1% of all American income earners based off the records I could find. What this means is to be richer than Harry Steenbock, you had to be Greta Garbo or Rockefeller or J. Paul Getty or Henry Ford. It was inherited wealth. So Steenbock was, a self-made man, I think you could say. But this was about as wealthy as you could get. Now, the real question is, why did I just spend 10 minutes of your life walking through the income of a professor in the middle of the 20th century? Well, the reason for that, I actually had a professor ask me that during my dissertation defense, and I will tell you what I told her, which is, I didn't come to grad school to write a biography of an obscenely wealthy white man. That's not what they teach us to do in PhD school. You've probably heard the saying that history is written by the winners. We actually take that as an admonishment as academic historians. That's not what we want to do. We understand that Churchill wrote his history of the World War II, but we don't just take that at face value. We want to interrogate it. We want to criticize it. And we know as historians, and these are some of the books that I've read that have taught me this over the course of my graduate career, we have to go out of our way to find the voices who are lost, to find the people who can't speak for themselves, to find the poor, the downtrodden, the minorities, to really represent the full fabric of human history. We can't just let the winners tell the story. We have to be critical about this. And so this posed a challenge for me. As I titled this slide, My slide formatting might be a little messed up here, but public history and critical history. I use the terms that political scientist Daniel Dresner used when he talked about thought leaders and public intellectuals. A thought leader is somebody who crafts a new narrative, who goes out and looks into the future and sees where we want to go to try to guide the conversation. And my job at Wharf, I'm not a spokesman for Wharf. I don't officially speak for Wharf, but I'm in the communications department, and what they want me to do is to look to Wharf's past to find out how can we still be a leader for the future? How can we continue to be one of the leading technology transfer offices in the country? And how do we shape the future? How do we do that? But as a historian, I was trained to be critical, to challenge these narratives, to test them, to find the holes in some of them. And so for a while, I kind of wrestled with this. How do I be true to the values of my discipline while also trying to be a thought leader? How do I be a public intellectual and a thought leader? What I decided was really, it's the challenge between those two things. Both of those roles, the thought leaders and public intellectuals, we need both of those things. If you read the New York Times op-ed page, maybe like there's the Thomas Friedman thought leaders and the Paul Krugman public intellectuals. We need both the bold thinkers who maybe say some things that they regret later and the curmudgeons who are always complaining about something, right? We need both of these. And the challenge between that, how to balance that, that's actually kind of the guiding force of what I want to do, is to figure out how do I speak to both of those things. So how do I do that? Well, I translate that question into what I would call 3 challenges. The first one is to challenge bloodless descriptions. This is the slide I showed you before. If you look closely at this, there's not a lot of human beings on the slide. There's the alumni, but other than that, there's not a lot of pronouns, there's not a lot of people. And so one of the things I want to do is tell this story in a more human way. Bring back the flesh and blood of the story of Wharf and tell that story in a way that feels more resonant to us as human beings. The second one is that the technology transfer industry can have a tendency to tell stories about itself that are a little bit ahistorical. These slides give you the numbers since the Bayh-Dole Act of 1980. The Bayh-Dole Act established for the first time a national policy for the patenting of federally funded research. So it allowed universities to, if you had a federal grant, the university could still control the patent on that, so we can still develop and commercialize the technology. This is a very important turning point in the technology transfer industry. And these are some of the numbers that happened from that. But I'm not as young as I used to be, but I'm still relatively young, and everything on this slide happened in my lifetime. Historians don't tend to talk about things that happen in their lifetime. And there's a much deeper, longer story that I think deserves to be told, that goes much further back than just this. And if you want to understand this story, you have to understand what was happening in 1925. You have to understand what was happening in the 19th century. This is, history doesn't just come out of nowhere. And we have to understand the longer history of this. And then the third challenge is, I'll just sort of leave their pictures up there, and you can see they all have something in common, and it's not just a photography, right? This is the second generation of Wharf trustees. The guy here at the head of this table is Donald Slichter. He's the son of Charles Slichter, who was in the previous slide. This is, yeah, okay, we'll just stay on this slide. Donald Slichter was, by the way, the president and chairman of the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company. When he was president, they were just completing a Great Lakes freighter that was the largest on the lakes at the time. He chaired the meeting where they decided what to name that freighter, and they decided to name it after his predecessor, who was Edmund Fitzgerald. So if there's any Gordon Lightfoot fans here, he wasn't responsible for the sinking, but he was responsible for what that was named. And this also shows you the financial results that Wharf had achieved by the time this photo was taken around, I believe, 1950, somewhere around there. And this shows you that Wharf was starting to make a pretty good sum of money. If you want to be rich, be sure to invest at the beginning of the Great Depression. Steenbock patent started earning money about 1928. That's a pretty good time to be in the market. And so Wharf was doing pretty well for itself. Just to drive this point home, I want to tell this story kind of in a full disclosure way. This is Thomas Brittingham Jr. This is a painting of him that is at the Wharf Tower right now. He crafted the investment policy that led to those results. You may know the Brittingham name from Brittingham Park. For the Brittingham House is where the university system president lives. Brittingham's father financed the Abraham Lincoln statue on Bascom Hill. So his life actually, the purpose of his career was built off of literally managing the money that his father left behind. He manages the trust. He manages the trust fund that his lumber baron father gave him. So you also, if you've been paying attention to the news lately, you may have heard about this. There's a group in the 1920s on campus that called itself the Ku Klux Klan. And Thomas Brittingham Jr. happened to be a member of that. He graduated in 1921, around the time that this group was being founded. This is obviously problematic. Now, this wasn't the national KKK. This wasn't the Southern KKK. But that's kind of damning with faint praise, right? That's not much of an improvement if you're going to name yourself after the group, right? It's not that big, not that much better. But what's happening in the 20s at the time was so World War I had just happened. Nationalism was very vibrant. A lot of racism was resurgent. Not that it ever went away, but this was a kind of vibrant time. So The Birth of the Nation was a movie that you may have heard of that was one of the most, before Gone with the Wind, this was the most widely watched movie in American history. It's an explicitly racist movie. And it was playing on campus here. And the culture of the times, this was in the air. And so they named their group after the Ku Klux Klan because The Birth of the Nation had told this story, because it was sort of like thought to be this historic group. After a few years, that hubbub dies down. They start to rethink these things. And one of the other crucial things that happen is the actual Klan shows up on campus. They don't call themselves the KKK, they call themselves Kappa Beta Lambda, KBL, which in secret means Klansmen be loyal. And they start recruiting engineers and farmers and sort of the more working class, the lower class parts of students. They weren't the leaders that joined the fraternal group that was the KKK. And so those guys say, you know what, this kind of looks bad. We're going to change the name. They changed it to Tumos. Literally translating Tumos from Latin means you are male. So they said, we're going to downplay the racism, we're going to play up the masculinity. We're going to lean into the masculine part of this, right? And so one of the guys in the picture I showed you that was with Don Slichter there was Walter Frautschi, and he was part of the group that changed the name, along with Porter Butts and Frederick March. So if you remember the controversy that happened a few months ago, Porter Butts and Frederick March had their name on places in the Memorial Union, and the union decided after a long debate to take their names off of them. All three of those guys, Butts, March, and Frautschi, were part of the group that changed the name, but I think that's literally the least they could have done, was to take the name KKK off the group, right? So I give them some credit for that, but I'm not here to lionize them. I'm here to sort of tell you this story, to show you this is the problem I'm wrestling with. The people that I'm studying, there's a problematic history here. This was the 20th century United States. Racism was real. So how do I deal with this specifically in my dissertation? Well, there's three ways. First of all, if I find racism, I write about it. This is one specific to Steenbock. I won't read that, but you can tell he's using racial slurs to describe George Quito. This was in 1947. Quito was an entomologist at UCLA. He was actually granted his PhD in absentia because he was a graduate student at UCLA during the war, and his family was shipped to an internment camp. So his advisor had to sneak in his insect samples so that he could complete his PhD in absentia, and he was granted it in absentia. After the war, he got a postdoc at UW-Madison. His supervising professor recommended him to Wharf, and he ended up, he was considered being hired to be a full-time head of Wharf's insecticide laboratories, which was a thing Wharf had at the time. We don't have those now. And Steenbock wrote this letter to the trustees to say he opposed the idea. And he opposed it on explicitly racist terms. He's using a lot of stereotypes about Japanese scientists, about trafficking in Asian stereotypes, and you can kind of see where there are. He happens to be entirely wrong about this. And Quito's advisor thought he was a great scientist. It's not true that Japanese scientists were considered to be sort of a lesser class, but this was Steenbock's attitude. The problem with this is that, so Quito was born to Japanese immigrant parents in California. He attended the state schools in his state. He got a scientific degree, scientific PhD. He got his scientific PhD during a time when the country of his ancestors was at war with the country of his birth, the United States. All of those things I just said, I could say about Harry Steenbock. He was a grandson of German immigrants. He didn't speak English until he was 5. He went to the state schools in his state, got a scientific PhD, and while he was getting a scientific PhD, it was during World War I, when the country of his ancestors was fighting the country of his birth. The Germans were fighting the Americans. So he should have been able to see a lot of commonalities between the two, but as racism often happens, it gets in the way of empathy, and he didn't see that. All he saw was Quito's race. This is something of a problem, right? The second thing I do is if I find the women, I talk about the women. And this isn't something, there can be kind of a dismissive attitude that, oh, well, we just kind of got to add women into the story. Women were central to Steenbock's life. He was very close with his mother. The relationship with his mother was pretty important in understanding who he became as a person. He had one sibling who was a sister who was 2 years older than him. She was 2 years older than him, but she started college at the same time because she had to stay behind for 2 years to take care of the apartment that they stayed in when they went into town to go to high school. And his relationship with his sister was also very important to forming who he was. I'll also point out a couple of things. This is a scientific article that Steenbock published, and you'll notice that he co-authored it with Mariana Sell and Mary Buell. Those are 2 women. Steenbock very rarely published a paper just with his own name, and very often his co-authors were women who were either his students or they were fellow biochemists. Mary Buell, actually, if you know the Buell House in University Heights, is the first house in University Heights. She grew up in that house. She was the first woman to earn a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Wisconsin. I believe it was 1921, I always forget the exact year, but it was 1919, 1921 when she was there. And according to Harry's sister, they were an item for a while, and they probably would have gotten married, except that Mary wanted to have a career, and Steenbock didn't want that. So she left and went to Iowa State. And then actually came back and worked at the Enzyme Institute on Old University Avenue for a while. And then the other woman on this slide, I always like to tell her story. I ended up writing about it in my dissertation because she comes into the Wharf story after 1925. But this is Lucy O'Keefe. She was hired as a secretary. She was one of the first 3 employees that Wharf hired full-time. And you can see in the slide here, her initials are here. This means that Harry Steenbock wrote the letter, dictated the letter, and Lucy O'Keefe typed it for him. This is Harry Russell, the Wharf's director, and she did the same thing. So there's evidence that she's there. But she went on to become Wharf's office manager and then was actually part of the Wharf leadership team by the 40s. So she worked at Wharf for about 30 years and rose up the ladder and was a very important person in Wharf's history. I like to compare her to, if you're a fan of the show Mad Men, she's very similar to the character Joan Holloway. Setting aside some of the more scandalous parts of Mad Men, I don't have any evidence that Lucy was having affairs or drinking a lot or anything like that, but it's a similar story. Somebody who started as just a pool of typists and rose her way up to actually being an executive at Wharf. And I like to tell her story because of that. So women were essential to Steenbock's life. And people have told the Steenbock story before without including women in it, and you just don't understand it if you don't understand the women. So the next thing I like to talk about is that Steenbock wasn't born white, he was born German. As I said, he didn't speak English until he was 5. In fact, he and his sister started kindergarten the year after the Bennett Law was repealed. The Bennett Law was a Wisconsin law which mandated that all primary schools teach in English. And it caused such a backlash that the Republicans actually got swept out of office and the Democrats were brought in and they repealed it. And so Harry and his sister Helen started school right after that it all happened, and they were still made fun of because not only did they speak German, they spoke Plattdeutsch, which is the lowland German, and the Prussians would make fun of them for having an accent, and the English speakers would make fun of them for not knowing English. But as you can see, this is a quote from Helen Steenbock Brinsmade, who's Harry's sister, talking about the freedom and liberty that she learned from Karl Schurz. Karl Schurz is this German-American immigrant who is kind of a quintessential example of assimilation, of German assimilation, of how to maintain your Germanness but then also become quintessentially American. And she quoted him as being their ancestor. And then this is an article that was written under Steenbock's name. I'm not entirely sure if he wrote it or if the university press office wrote it on his behalf. But he's also quoting Karl Schurz as being the source of the reform and the Wisconsin idea, basically. The Wisconsin traditions of research came out of Karl Schurz and these German Americans. And so it shows you that this is an important part of their heritage. I did go back and look and found out that Helen was saying in this that her grandparents were on Schurz's side and were fleeing the Prussians and were fleeing the Kaiser. Actually, her grandfather fought in the Prussian army, which put down Karl Schurz's revolution in 1848. So it's a little messier history than that. But it's more important to understand the ideology. This is the way they thought of themselves. They identified as Germans more so than just sort of like white Midwesterners, right? And so what this ends up adding up to is that I refer to Steenbock as a mugwump in one of the chapters. Anybody know the term mugwump? Nobody raise their hands, by the way, for you at home, just so we know. Not to call you out, but I have to let them know. So mugwump is kind of like being a grand poobah. It's kind of like the people who were called mugwumps, their enemies were calling them this to say that they're these high-minded, kind of highfalutin kind of types. But this was a 19th century reform tradition that grew out of things like abolition, things like the temperance movement. And the idea was that it put a lot of emphasis on moral uplift, on doing the right thing, on social obligation, on reforming corruption. And this tradition is very strong in Wisconsin. And I think you can see a lot of the things that Steenbock is writing here. This is how he explained the purpose of Wharf in 1940. He's referencing a lot of mugwump traditions. What happened in the 20th century was you have kind of a split. So you have progressives on one hand who are saying, if we actually want these reforms to happen, we're going to have to be more aggressive. We're going to have to do things like really support unions. We're going to have a progressive income tax. We're going to have to start institute direct election of senators, primary elections, things like that. The big reform movements that we all associate with the La Follettes and progressives. There were another branch of the mugwumps who basically said, no, we're going to emphasize the individual part of this. And this becomes the formation of this kind of associational, individual-minded conservatism of the 20th century. And Steenbock, as you can see from the slide, took that second route. He was, as I say in my dissertation, he was conservative in every sense of the word. He continued to be a mugwump long after that was an outdated terminology. So things like what he's saying here is basically he wanted something like Wharf to prevent the government from running the university. He wanted to prevent the socialization university. He wanted to show that individual professors could actually stand up for what they believed in and not have to rely on government funding to do that. But the other thing I want to point out about this slide is it's universalizing language. He's not saying, I grew up German, therefore I believe this. He's not saying, my relationship with my mother informed it. I could go through all these things and kind of talk about how I see Steenbock's childhood in some of these things. I can see how this is a very peculiar way of talking about things. But he's kind of washing all that away. He's kind of avoiding all of that. He's not talking about that. He's not talking about his German heritage. And so the story I want to tell about Steenbock is one that really recovers his humanity. And I'm not trying to sort of expose his racism or expose his sexism necessarily. And some sort of I'm not trying to be William Nephew digging up his tax returns. Like, that's not the point of what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to remember his humanity and include his humanity in that story and tell it in a way that, you know, he's a sinner in a broken world like everybody else, right? That's basically what I'm trying to remind people, is to show that when he says facts are facts and logic is logic, there's nothing really universal about the Steenbock story. It's a very unusual, peculiar, he's a weird dude, you know, to put it that way, right? And we have a tendency to think that, you know, a guy who was white and male and made a good living in the 20th century was somehow normal, and that's actually not really the case. So, of course, that's kind of my methods, but being a historian, I can't just say that and expect you to believe it. We have to actually go back and find sources. And these are all things that I concluded after about 5 years of researching Harry Steenbock's life. So let's go back to the beginning. The first question I asked, and I actually thought this was just going to be like the first chapter, which was, why did Steenbock patent? It ended up being basically the whole dissertation. So I had to figure out, why did he patent? Like, this is the guy who's famous for patenting, the guy who got published in newspapers because of his patent. Why did he do it? And so I found a manuscript he first wrote in late 1925, finalized in January 1926, in which it was called The Relations of the Writer to the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation and the Events that Led to Its Organization. I won't say that again, but it's a long title. But it's him writing at the time, this is why I did what I did. And you had this sentence, which is pretty clear. The oleomargarine manufacturer can make his products superior to butter. What he is saying is that if they use my vitamin fortification process on margarine, then they will be able to compete with butter. And the dairy industry is a strong supporter of the College of Agriculture. He didn't want margarine to be competing with butter. Like, that's kind of long story short. He wanted to prevent the fortification of margarine. That was what originally motivated him. But of course, this is only the top of the slide, right? So you know it's going to be a little more complicated than that. This is the beginning of that sentence. In the meantime, another matter came up. In the meantime of what? Like, I went back to this manuscript to find the beginning of the story. What is this in the meantime business? What do I got to go find out now? Where are we going with this, right? And in the meantime, so this is how that manuscript actually begins. In 1920, the writer and co-workers discovered that vitamin A, now wait a minute, now I got to go learn about vitamin A. What's this stuff? I thought this was a vitamin D story. Also, what do you mean co-workers? What's this co-workers business? Because if you look at the patent, there's no co-workers, there's just Harry Steenbock. Yes, he assigned it to Wharf, but Wharf didn't exist in 1920. So what does all of this mean? How do I make sense of this? There's a vitamin A story. There seems to be an earlier invention that has something to do that's not about irradiating food. What do I do with all of this? So I then go to his articles. So this is the article that fat-soluble vitamin 17. This is the article at the bottom of this. He says that, so he and Archie Black published this article about the irradiation of foods, of using ultraviolet light. At the bottom of it, they say, we have the intention of filing a patent. Patents have been filed for this. And you also notice that the University of Wisconsin, patents have been filed to be handled through the University of Wisconsin. So obviously something changed there, because he ended up not giving it to the Wisconsin, he ended up creating Wharf. So that's part of another interesting part of the story. And then the second part, well, there's the co-workers. There's this A. Black. Who's this Archie Black guy? What do I want to know about him? And there's the other part. That's a Roman numeral 17. This wasn't the beginning of the story. There were 16 articles that came before this. So now I got to go read 17 scientific articles. I'm not a biochemist. I got in this to write about patents. Okay, so what do we have? Well, turns out fat-soluble vitamin series was the central work of Steenbock's life. And there were, I put the last one up here so I can remember the number, 42 different installments stretching from all the way back to 1920 to 1934. 1918. 1918 to 1934. So there's 40 articles of these. And I had to kind of walk through what does this all talk about. So the fat-soluble vitamin 6 was the one, the in the meantime business, when he talks about he and co-workers working on vitamin A, what he was talking about was a concentrated form of vitamin A, that they'd used alfalfa and other vegetative matter to concentrate vitamin A into a concentrated form. And that's what he was talking about in that. And that was actually the first time he tried to patent, was on this concentrated vitamin A. But then you can also see a couple other things here. I don't think I have any other highlights on this, but you can see 17 and 19. You can look at the titles are basically the same between 17 and 19. So we're also talking about this isn't one article. This wasn't just an article that they published and this is the invention and we're going to patent it. There's an ongoing scientific story happening here that stretches all the way back. The other thing I want to point out is it didn't start out as fat-soluble vitamins. It started out as fat-soluble vitamine. That's because at the time they thought there was only one that was fat-soluble. So, in order to understand all of that, I have to go back and understand the ancient history of vitamins, which goes all the way back to ancient Egypt. So the ancient Egyptians knew that if you ate liver, you were less likely to go night blind. And what we know now is that's because liver has vitamin A in it. You also had sunlight, so we knew that, we'll start with the limes there. So you may know the story about the limeys, that the English sailors figured out that they were getting scurvy, and that if you fed them limes, and in some cases sauerkraut, they would not get scurvy. That's because limes have vitamin C in it. And then in Norway, they would feed kids cod liver oil to prevent them from getting rickets during the winter. And they also knew that one of the reasons why you get rickets in the winter is because there's no sunlight, because sunlight creates vitamin D. So these old wives' tales, these kind of traditional stories, they didn't know why these were happening, and a lot of scientists weren't even sure that these were real, but there was this accumulating evidence that there was something happening here that was going on. So while the history of those vitamins is really ancient, the science of it is not that old. The people on this slide, the two guys on the left here are Christian Eichmann and Frederick Gellin Hopkins. Eichmann's on the top, Hopkins is there. They actually end up winning a joint Nobel Prize for the discovery of vitamins. Eichmann was working in the Dutch East Indies on water-soluble vitamins. He basically figured out that if you polish rice, that it takes out some sort of substance, and if you ate polished rice, you get beriberi. And beriberi is a deficiency of vitamin B, and this is a water-soluble substance. Hopkins was the one who figured out that there's the accessory factors. If you added milk to a diet of mice, that they would not, their bones would be stronger. And so this is the first realization that there's something else, an accessory factor that ended up being a fat-soluble factor, which becomes vitamin A. So around the 1920s, so Casimir Funk is the guy in the middle. He was the one who came up with the term vitamine. He was studying thiamine, which is the B, we know now is a B vitamin. And he was also working on rice. And he made the proposition that all of these accessory factors were amines, which is a nitrogen compound. And so he thought, okay, they're vital, they're amines, we'll call them vitamines. That was his idea, and he coined the term. The problem with that is they're not all amines. And so eventually, long story short, eventually they dropped the E and it's vitamins. And so these two here in the center, this is Margaret Davis and Elmer McCollum, and they're working in parallel. They're working off the basis of Hopkins. And so Hopkins is even the beginning of the story. There's also people in Eastern Europe. There's lots of people that are kind of piecing all this stuff together, and all this stuff is coming around. And around the 1910s or so, so Margaret Davis was a woman who, she had to move back to Madison because her mother had died, and so she had to take care of her father. She had to drop out of school in California and came back, and she was looking for a job one day and just kind of walked into McCollum. Elmer McCollum was a professor at Wisconsin. She walked into his office and he said, okay, you can help me with my experiments. And all they did was discover vitamin A, basically. They got credit for discovering vitamin A. The problem with that is, as I said, these two guys won, on the left side, they won the Nobel Prize. McCollum claimed to be discoverer of vitamin A. He called himself that. But what they actually did was they just named it. They named it vitamin A. But they isolated the factor that ended up becoming the fat-soluble A. And what they called it was fat-soluble A. Casimir Funk is over here calling them vitamins. And eventually they kind of negotiated it so that McCollum hated the word vitamin because he didn't think it was accurate. But eventually there's a compromise, and fat-soluble A becomes vitamin A. Fat-soluble B becomes vitamin B. And then they discovered that the fat-soluble vitamin is actually two things. It's vitamin A and vitamin D. And so now we're going to call them vitamin A and vitamin D. They're two separate things. And so this is here on the right, this is Babcock and Harry Russell. This is Babcock here. This is William Henry. Henry Mall is named after him right out here up front. And this is E.B. Hart. This is George Humphrey, and that's Harry Russell. But these guys were the ones who worked with Steenbock on the single grain ration experiment. And that was also where Elmer McCollum originated as well. He was a junior professor here at Wisconsin, and he actually taught Steenbock his first graduate seminar. And Steenbock knew all of this history. It's also interesting that he claimed a patent by himself, but he actually wrote histories of all of this, that all of these vitamins were being discovered, that this is a long history. He's writing a longer version of that. So what did Steenbock actually discover? So he's working on the narrow question of fat-soluble D, vitamin D. It was actually called the anti-rachitic vitamin because it had not yet become what we know now as vitamin D. And so people had figured out, it's another World War I story. So after World War I, Harriet Chick, who worked for the Lister Institute as in Listerine, it was an English Institute, but she was actually working in Vienna after the war. And the reason she went to Vienna was because a lot of children were starving, and a lot of children were getting rickets, and there's a lot of nutritional problems. And she was leading a team there that was trying to figure out how to make them healthier, how to solve their malnutrition. And they had understood by this point, and were honing on the science, that rickets could be prevented both by putting children out in the sunlight, putting them on balconies, and you give them sunlight and they would have stronger bones. Or you could feed them cod liver oil. And they knew that this Norwegian fisherfolk solution, they were actually showing that it could work. The confusing part was that nobody could quite figure out why these two things work together. Cod liver oil and sunlight. Sitting out in the sun and eating cod liver oil. They don't seem to have anything in common. So nobody could quite figure out, okay, what's the connection here? And so the Lister people under Harriet Schick, and by the way, so Harriet Schick has two assistants, Margaret Hume and Hannah Henderson Smith. They're actually her assistants, but they work in her laboratory, and they start trying to test out these experiments. So what they have is they have rats that they're putting in jars, and they will radiate one rat, and they'll feed the rat some cod liver oil. They'll actually feed them liver sometimes to feed them. And they notice that when they leave the rats overnight together, that somehow if you irradiate one rat, put it in the same cage with a rat that has not been irradiated overnight, over the course of time, both of the rats don't get rickets. Both of them seem to be protected. And they couldn't figure out why this was happening. So they tried to test it. So they actually actually keep the rat separate. They keep the jar separate. They irradiate the jar. They put the rats in the jar. They actually keep the other rat like down the room and then put them in the jar at the same time. And yet the rats in the same jar are still both being cured from rickets. And they can't figure out what is happening here because they've kept the rats separate. So they know that there's no like contamination. They know that like the rat isn't accidentally getting some light or some kind of thing like this. And they come up with this hypothesis that the vitamins are jumping between the rats somehow. Maybe it's when you irradiate the air becomes vitamin D, becomes anti-rickettic, as they call it. Anti-rickettic meaning it cures rickets. And so the idea is that the air is charged. And there's some science at the time that kind of suggests that this kind of makes sense. So Steenbock is reading all of this. He knows Frederick Hopkins. He knows Christian Eichmann. He's been working with McCollum. He knows all of this story. He doesn't buy this idea that the vitamin D is jumping from air to air. And so he comes up with the idea that they're going to irradiate the rations, basically. But first they need to test it. So first thing they try to do is they try to reproduce the Lister experiments. And at first, they invent a process where the refuse in the cage is dropping through the wire at the bottom. So they think that what's happening is that they're eating the sawdust. And they're going to test that theory. So they put wire in the bottom of the cage, and all the refuse is dropping to the bottom. It's still happening. They're still having cages. They're still having rats that have not been irradiated or being cured by vitamin D, or seem to be getting vitamin D somehow. They can't figure out why that's the case. Then what they do is they clean the screen. So the wire mesh that they've been putting at the bottom of the cage and following it through, then they clean it so that it's not sticky anymore. And then when they try it now the rat who's not being irradiated, who's not being fed any vitamin D, now that rat does get sick. And they didn't actually know at the time why that was happening. What we now know is that for the same reason that when you absorb vitamin D through the skin, that what's happening is that the sunlight is hitting the fat in your skin and is fortifying it with vitamin D. And so what's happening is the rats were rubbing up against the wire. The grease from their hair was rubbing on the wire, and then they're gnawing on the wire, and so they're eating the fat, and they're absorbing the fat from that process, and that's what they were doing. So Steenbock didn't understand the science behind this process. All he knew is he could test it and he could prove it, and he could irradiate so then they took out the middleman and they said, we're just going to irradiate the rations, the food directly, and we'll feed the rats that way, and that worked. And this proved that there was a process that you could now fortify food with vitamin D. This still doesn't explain why he patented it. So am I still with you? Have I explained the science well enough so you're all following it well? Okay. So this explains the science of it, right? And explains that this is a communal process. It's a process that he's drawing on long traditions of science and technology. But it doesn't explain then why is he knows that he's co-authoring these. He even said himself, the writer and co-workers invented a process. So how does this then lead to him wanting to file for a patent? Well, one thing you need to understand, first of all, is that he had a couple of different models to work from. One was Stephen Babcock. So you know Babcock if you know the UW-Madison campus, you know Babcock ice cream, you know Babcock Hall. You may also know that this is the Butterfat Test, the famous Babcock Butterfat Test. Babcock, as I think I explained earlier, was one of the people who had figured out that, okay, protein, carbohydrates, and fats. He had this theory that, okay, all these people are saying that protein, carbohydrates, and fats are all you need to eat to be healthy. But he knew that he could doctor a piece of cow manure to have the right amount of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, and he knew he wasn't going to feed the piece of manure to the cow. That's not enough. And so he wanted to test this theory out. The problem was he tried to do that at first, and a couple cows died. One of them died, and one of them got very sick and almost died. And the animal husbandry guy on campus was pretty upset by this. And William Henry said, okay, I'm taking you off this project. You can't do this. I need you to go do this other thing, which is way more practical, which maybe isn't a great use of your German education. I mean, Babcock is one of the world's great trained German chemists at the time. And what Henry says is, I need you to go figure out how to measure butterfat for farmers, because it's a problem that is facing the industry. And this is something that farmers had tried to do. Farmers had tried to do it themselves. Other chemists had tried to do this, and nobody kind of had been able to figure out. The reason why this is a problem is because if you aren't able to measure the butterfat in milk accurately, then wholesalers might skim it. They might try to sell it's like 2% milk as 1% milk, or they might try to basically douse it with water and try to sell it, and you don't figure it out until you get home. Like this is a problem that the milk markets are not very stable because of this. This is a serious industry problem. Babcock, being an expert scientist, figures this out. Figures out the Babcock Butterfat Test, and it revolutionizes the industry. It really is kind of why we know today Wisconsin is a dairy state, was because Stephen Babcock figured out how to do this and turned dairy from an ancient trade into a scientific art. There's some calculations that he saved, within like a couple of years, he saved the dairy industry the entire equivalent of the UW-Madison budget within just like a couple of years, a couple $100,000 in the course of the time. So he becomes famous. Like he is world famous. I can go through the Capital Times and the State Journal, and you can see like every time when Babcock turns 70, when he turns 71, when he turns 77, it gets a front page story in the paper, and they're selling a party, they're having all these birthday parties. And part of this myth of Babcock is that he didn't patent the test. He refused to patent the test because he thought this was basically the ethics of science at the time, where that you need to give away. Scientists don't profit off of this. He also said though that because he didn't patent it, it took a lot longer for the test to be standardized, to be used very well. He couldn't control it, and so a lot of bad versions of the test go out there, and it kind of, his name gets dragged through the mud a little bit. And this becomes part of that story. But Steenbock is living with this living legend. Babcock was retired by the time, but he knew Babcock. They worked together in the same place. He saw Babcock all the time, and you have this story that this is the communal model of how science should work. Babcock didn't do this for himself. He did this for the state. And this is a social obligation, as I told you, the mugwump kind of idea, the social obligation of science to benefit the world. The other model is a slightly negative example. So I told you McCollum earlier that he claimed to be the discoverer of vitamin A. But the story is more complicated than that. It's a group effort. It's a collective effort. McCollum actually had a reputation for working with women like Margaret Davis. There were other women, Nina Simmons, who was a student here who followed McCollum to Johns Hopkins when he left, and a woman named Cornelia Kennedy. And it was actually a master's thesis written by Cornelia Kennedy that was the first ever document to use the term fat-soluble A and water-soluble B. McCollum originally gave Cornelia Kennedy credit. When he would write about the fact that he was the first one, he'd sort of discovered this nomenclature, he would cite the article, because he was Cornelia Kennedy's advisor, so he was a co-author on the master's thesis, and he would cite that master's thesis. Over time, he kind of forgot to include that. He started citing a later article and basically said, I was the one who came up with this, right? And so after McCollum leaves, he leaves for Johns Hopkins, and this is, you may have gotten ahead of me because I've left this slide up here, and you can now read this story. There's a controversy called professional courtesy. What this controversy was E.B. Hart wrote a letter to Science basically saying that when McCollum left, he took a lot of notebooks. And he actually published then, with Nina Simmons, he published a couple articles that were based off of Wisconsin research, and he published it under the Johns Hopkins names. He did not get the permission to publish it from the director of the experiment station at Wisconsin. And he didn't credit Harry Steenbock. He didn't include Steenbock's name. And so they're basically saying professional courtesy demands that Steenbock was part of those experiments. You should have included him as a co-author. You didn't. McCollum writes back and it just basically says, Steenbock, I didn't include Steenbock because you didn't do anything that important. Steenbock then writes back, and this is kind of where I learned that you don't mess with Harry Steenbock. He wrote a letter back and he said, I conceived the experiments. I did most of the work on those experiments. Me and Nina Simmons did all this work. All McCollum did was feed the rats. And on top of that, and this part didn't become public, and there's not really many sources for this, but apparently when McCollum left, one of the things I think McCollum does deserve credit for, I don't think he deserves as much credit for discovering vitamin A, because there's all this collective story, there's all these other people that are doing it, but he does deserve credit for being the first person to create a rat colony at the UW-Madison campus. And this is actually the first person in the world to ever have a laboratory rat colony. The problem was when he left for Johns Hopkins, he let all the rats go. And so Steenbock, they had to go out and either find the rats or just buy new rats and kind of reconstitute the colony. So there were letters later on. There was the Babcock Dairy Club wanted to invite McCollum back to give a speech. And Steenbock wrote them a letter saying, you really don't want to do this. We do not like this guy. He is not a friend of the university. And so what you see here is a claiming of credit that Steenbock did not want to follow. And so after this incident, McCollum had a reputation for working with women. And he would then write an autobiography later emphasizing Margaret Davis, telling the story about this woman that he invited into his laboratory and all these kinds of stories. And he portrayed himself as this early feminist. But there are letters, people writing back and forth, that basically said, no. The reason he worked with women is because they couldn't do what Harry Steenbock did. If they published a letter like this in Science, nobody was going to pay any attention to them because they were women. So he surrounded himself with women because they couldn't take the risk of challenging him. And so that's why he did it. And so everybody in Wisconsin, following the Babcock example, following this community example, we're a team, we're working to support the dairy industry, we're working to support our home state. They don't like McCollum. They don't drag his name through the mud. There was some to talk about after he stole the research notebooks that they were going to arrest him. Steenbock wrote a letter saying, we thought about calling the police. We decided not to because we didn't think that'd be good. We don't want to, I forget the term exactly, but I think he said, we don't want to air our dirty linen, that kind of thing. But Steenbock has this example in mind. And one of Steenbock's cousins in an interview later said, he said, of course the whole McCollum affair left him bitterly disappointed. And this is one of the shaping things that shapes the way Steenbock thinks about scientific credit. He has a positive example of Babcock, he has a negative example of McCollum. So this gives you a little bit of an example, a little bit of understanding of why this question of how to serve the dairy industry is tooling around in Steenbock's mind. Why he might want to take this discovery, which he knows is part of a whole scientific discourse. It's part of a very complicated history of vitamins, in which no single person really deserves the single amount of credit. But he knows that something has to happen here to fulfill his social obligation. He's kind of working with this. And all of these things about reputation and gender and all these things are working around in his mind. The second part, so I kind of got a little ahead of myself here. I should have showed you the slide while I was telling that story. These are academic traditions of Wisconsin. This is the dairy barn, which is over a couple blocks away. At the time, it was a total show palace. It's basically the equivalent of what the Discovery Building is today. You had a ramp that would take a truck of hay up to the third floor, and you could rotate it around, dump the hay out, and then take the ramp all the way back down. That ramp doesn't exist anymore. It's fallen into a little disrepair. But the idea of this was to show, if you fund science, you farmers out in Wisconsin, this is what we can do for you. It had a cooling system that was incredibly advanced for its time, that circulated the air, all kinds of crazy things. And it was really, you can see all these like filigrees and all this kind of architecture that's all kind of very fancy. And it's still, if you stand right next to it today, it's still pretty impressive. There's a silo right next to it that's taller than that, but that one's still pretty impressive. I think at the time it was something like the largest silo in the world. And it's all made of brick, and it's an advanced kind of system. And you have the Babcock example. These are all things that, Steenbock, son of Wisconsin, is thinking about all these things. These are all shaping the type of science that he's doing. So like he's competing with historians, Freudian slip. He's competing with biochemists in England, Yale, Cambridge, Utrecht, like all of these German and European universities that are the greatest universities in the world at the time. And then also Columbia, where you have pediatricians. You have Harriet Crick in the Lister Institute. By the way, Harriet Chick is a woman running a laboratory, and she has PhD working for her. These are not women who are, I forgot to mention this before, but these are not women who are secretaries or assistants. These are women working for women who all have PhDs. And they're all the greatest scientists in the world. And so one of the main competitors of Steenbock is in Columbia, where they have pediatricians working on this same question of rickets, of how do we try to help babies who are starving. They're working on cows. And to understand why this is sort of an industrial story and a commercial story, a collective story, it's because this is the agricultural campus. They're studying it in cows, they're not studying it in babies, and this is a different kind of science, and it leads them to different insights and different conclusions. One of them being, this is a bottle, our director of investments at Wharf sent me a picture of this, and she said, we don't understand why there's a vitamin D bottle at this flea market. And I said, that's not a vitamin D bottle, that's a milk bottle, that's a milk cap. This is one of the early examples of vitamin D milk, and it might be a little too dark, but if you can see around the edge there, it says the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation. So if you bought vitamin D milk in the 1930s, odds were it would be stamped with the Wharf seal of approval, because it meant that it had been to the Wharf control laboratories and they had tested it and to show that it actually had the vitamin D that was in that. And so there's no coincidence that you end up with an experiment on cows then leading towards the creation of vitamin D milk. There's a reason why all that happens. It's because it's from Wisconsin. Actually, on eBay, I just bought this. This is the milk cap that it only cost me $2, but It's still in pretty good shape. But then there's another third part of this story, which is that there has to be financial and political opportunity. So as I said, there's the old, in the meantime sentence that I showed you before. Steenbock had this vitamin A concentrate. And he was just as concerned about vitamin A, the vitamin A concentrate in margarine, as he was with vitamin D. So milk does have vitamin A in it, so you could make margarine equal to butter if you had a vitamin A concentrate. If you added his concentrate to margarine, then margarine could be equal. But nobody was, at the time, universities didn't patent or license anything. They weren't in the patenting and licensing business. So basically they said, if you want to go patent that, that's fine. If you want to do what Charles Burgess, the battery guy, did in the Burgess Battery Company, and you want to go off and patent, we'll let you do that. But the university isn't really in the patenting business. And so eventually, after Steenbock kind of badgered them for a while, they hired a lawyer, but they didn't pay the lawyer. So the lawyer just kind of lets the application sit there, and eventually it expires, and you can't do anything about it. So then this vitamin D thing comes along. And not only with vitamin A, and this is what Steenbock said, with the vitamin A thing, you could make margarine that was equal to butter. With vitamin D, you could make a margarine that was better than butter, because butter doesn't have vitamin D in it. And so he's even more concerned about this. And on top of that, he had discovered a guy from the Mellon Institute had written him a letter saying, could you tell me about your vitamin A concentrate? Because I'd like to learn a little bit more about that. Can you tell me like how much alfalfa you use, like all this kind of thing? How much of the vitamin A can you actually pull out of it? Steenbock wrote him back. This is what you do as a scientist. You exchange it. And then Steenbock's reading a journal, and he notices this announcement that this guy who just written him was working on a fellowship from the Swift Margarine Company. And so Steenbock has this in his, I found it in his papers, and there's this blue pencil circling the margarine word and underlining margarine, margarine, margarine. He's like, they got me. They've snuck in. They stole my science. I told the administrators they're going to do that. So with this vitamin D thing, then he wants to do it better second time around. What's different this time? Well, first of all, Quaker Oats has a farm on the Madison campus. Quaker Oats was looking for, it's actually started with, they're looking for a way to make money off of all the discarded hulls that come out of the oatmeal making process. And so Quaker Oats is headquartered in Chicago. They have a big plant in Cedar Rapids, Iowa that is still there. You can drive by. And they have a farm that they created on the Madison. This is part of a development around the time of industrial fellowships. That Quaker Oats is sponsoring industrial fellows, beginning to sponsor industrial fellows in the College of Agriculture. And one of the things that happens was that they used the Forest Products Laboratory, had these giant machines, and they were able to distill the oat hulls down into a substance called furfural, which was a very rare substance. And before that, but with this process, furfural becomes a very common chemical, and Quaker Oats becomes like the world's leading producer of furfural. There's a guy named Charles Miner who's a consulting chemist for Quaker, and he knows about Steenbock's work. He's keeping up to date on it. And then in the middle of all this, the Mellanbys, or these Scottish, it's actually, this is one other thing we talk about, Henry Mellanby is actually Henry and May Mellanby. I might be getting his first name wrong, but it's a married couple. And his wife was working on the dental work, and he was working on the bones. And what they discovered was that oatmeal and dental caries in children were aligned. If children ate a lot of oatmeal, they tended to get more cavities, and their bones tended to be weaker. And they found a correlation in this, and this is because now we know oatmeal doesn't have vitamin D in it. And this became a world headline. There's a New York Times article about how the Scottish dominance of poetry is going to fail or something like that. Like there's all these kind of like very aggressive, like, and it's a more subtle scientific story than this, because there's lots of things that don't have vitamin D in it, and it's not necessarily they're eating oatmeal, it's that they're only eating oatmeal and not having oatmeal supplemented by milk or supplemented by butter and those kinds of things. But this Quaker Oats gets very concerned, and they go to Steenbock, and Charles Miner comes to Steenbock and basically says, we want to buy this from you. And that's when Harry Russell and Charles Slichter noticed that, well, now this isn't just a risk. We actually have an offer on the table for about $1 million that Quaker Oats can back this. We're still not sure the university wants to buy it, wants to go along with this, but we're paying attention now because we think there's actually some money involved here. Miner introduces Steenbock to this proposal, the Hoskin-Wiles proposal. Steenbock basically says, I'm not interested in selling this. This is not what Babcock would do. I'm not going to sell my science to a corporation. I did this to protect my state. I'm not here to make money. I'm not trying to sell out to the state. And Miner says, well, there's a guy down the street, another chemist, who wrote this article about promotion of scientific research. What they said is, if the university is not very good at patenting, then we'll get some friends of the university to do it. And they will manage the process, and they will make money, and then they'll take the money and they'll give it back to the university. So this is the idea that becomes Wharf. Steenbock gets this. He takes it to Slichter and Russell. They go to the university, and they persuade the regents to allow the creation of Wharf. Now, an interesting thing here is I mentioned earlier that William Evu believed that the university should only be funded by taxpayer dollars. There's a regent named Daniel Grady who is in the same political stripe, the political ideology as that. He believes that, along with Bob La Follette, that foundations like the Rockefellers and the Fords, we don't want any Rockefeller money. That was our idea. We don't need Rockefeller money coming to the university. It's going to corrupt the university. And so they passed a resolution called the Grady Resolution, which says the university will not accept any money from educational endowments or organizations of like character. They passed that, and then 2 weeks later, Grady sponsors a resolution to create Wharf, which is an educational endowment of like character. So one of the things that's interesting about this story is that we can read that from our modern eyes and think that there's a conflict here, that there's a disagreement here. But what is actually happening is this is a loyalty story. This is a story about Wisconsin. It's a different kind of story. So then the next sort of turn in the story. So Wharf is created. Long story short, that's only a couple of chapters in the dissertation. I can talk about that next time. But the first meeting of the Board of Trustees of Wharf, they do three things. First thing is they say, okay, we're going to agree to take the patents that Steenbock has applied for. We're going to agree to take the rights to them. We'll agree to compensate Steenbock with some of the net royalties. That's the first thing they pass. The second one is they authorize George Haight. That's a bust of George Haight there on the left. I can tell he's a very important person because they turned his head bronze. It's actually, the Memorial Union actually created that, and we found it in the archives, and they let us have it. But they said, so the trustees say to George Haight, we authorize you to go negotiate with Quaker Oats to give them the rights to use the process in their oatmeal. And then the third thing they do is they say, we're not going to allow Quaker Oats or any other licensee to irradiate fats. We're not going to allow the irradiation of fats without the explicit approval of the University of Wisconsin. And by fats, they mean margarine, alternatives to butterfat. And so they're going to pay Steenbock, they're going to go make a lot of money, and they're going to make sure the margarine company doesn't make any of that money. Now, on its face, what I just told you, going back to that manuscript I found from 1925, this is exactly what Steenbock wanted, right? This is exactly what he intended. He wanted to protect the dairy industry, the margarine industry. But a week after that meeting, he writes George Haight this letter. And he says, as a worker attempting to get all adjusted upon a logical basis, I do not like the injection of bias by the foundation. He's basically telling Haight, I'm going to get paid for the alienation of an industry. I don't like the ethics of this. I don't like the way this looks. I know I agreed to it originally, but I've changed my mind. And what he tells Haight is, I don't want your money anymore. You can keep your money, but what I want is control. I want veto power. This shouldn't be the university having veto power. I want to be able to make sure that my scientific values are being fulfilled through Wharf. And as I said, Haight's the kind of guy who gets a bust in bronze made of him. He's not a pushover. He basically handles Steenbock pretty deftly, and Wharf does what it's going to do. He kind of shovels Steenbock aside, and we know what happens. Steenbock ends up becoming a millionaire by making a lot of money from Wharf. And so this is, to read you how I wrapped this up in my dissertation, I thought I would just sort of read you the thesis statement from what I wrote. So the story of Harry Steenbock and his patents could be told as a tragedy. The more he grasped how to control his science, the more that control slipped through his fingers. But to paraphrase Karl Marx, the story could also be told as farce. The more Steenbock lost the scientific authority he desired, the more famous he became for his scientific accomplishments. The wealthier he became from his science, the more he was celebrated for turning down a fortune for the sake of science. For that reason, unlike many traditional biographies, my dissertation does not evaluate the historical influence of a lone individual by chronicling the achievements of a great scientist. Unlike Charles Darwin, no one speaks of Steenbockism. Nor like Isaac Newton have we inherited Steenbock's fundamental laws of vitamins. In any event, decades of scholarship in science and technology studies have proven that more than standing on the shoulders of giants, scientists practice their vocation within dense social networks that co-produce knowledge imbricated by cultural, socioeconomic, and intellectual systems of making and doing. That's a very technical terminology, but it's a group enterprise, right? It's a group enterprise. In the case of nutrition science, dozens of investigators have been given some form of credit, or could be given some form of credit, for discovering vitamins or revolutionizing how humans understand them. In truth, they each contributed to configurations of knowledge and power that span continents and millennia. The same must be said of famous patent holders, from Eli Whitney and Thomas Edison to IBM and Samsung. IBM and Samsung are the two leading most patents are granted to those. They're the two highest ranked utility patents each year go to those two companies. And we also must say the same thing about creators of nonprofit foundations, from John D. Rockefeller to Bill and Melinda Gates. Has Steenbock been a different sort of person? Had he been less stubborn, less prideful, less rooted in 19th century German-American notions of individual initiative and moral uplift, he might have chosen a different path. He did not set out to create an industry, reform the academy, or innovate new strategies of scientific commercialization. A man of dedicated conservatism in almost every sense of that word, he sought to preserve what he perceived to be traditions of science and agriculture, not to change them. And he oriented himself within those traditions according to his own professional commitments. Acting from those values, he gave away the rights to his patent before he realized what the full implications would be. In the process, he managed to catalyze a new type of academic patenting institution. Steenbock's loss of control as an inventor and his relative insignificance as a lone scientist were the very reasons he became the single most seminal individual in the history of academic patenting. He appears never to have fully comprehended the irony, but he lived it nonetheless. And that's it. So, thank you. I like to show that we've gotten a little better at Wharf. They're not all white guys anymore. It's not just a photography. And I'll show you that too. So. And I'm happy to take any questions. And what time we have left? I went a little longer than an hour there, but.
You could have gone on. That was great.
Yes.
How much is Wharf made off of the invention?
Yeah, I didn't say that. So how much is Wharf made was the question. Wharf is now worth about $2.6 billion. It depends. It's all invested in the stock market, so it depends on where the stock market is right now. But $2.6 billion. As I said, $14 million made specifically off the Steenbock patents. And
can you say that more precisely? Because I'm hearing million and not billion.
Billion, yes, $2.6 billion.
Thank you.
Yeah, so $14 million made directly off the royalties of the Steenbock invention. By the time that invention was dedicated to the public in 1946, Wharf was worth about $54 million, in addition to about, I forget this off the top of my head, but I think at that point they'd given about $18 million to the university already, so somewhere around $60 million total by the time the Steenbock patents are done with. Around the time that the Steenbock patents are expiring, you have Warfarin, which is Wharf's second big invention, invented by Carl Paul Link. So it's dicumarol, warfarin, and warfarin, which is also known as Coumadin, warfarin and sodium. Warfarin is a rat poison and anticoagulant. That also earns about $14 million, a little bit less than the Steenbock patents when you adjust for inflation, because it happened 20 years later. And then we also have a number of other inventions. I usually have a spiral here that shows you a lot of other Wharf inventions, but there have been a number of other inventions over the course of the years. The bulk of Wharf's money comes from the investment endowment that's been invested over 100 years. It's about $2.6 billion. Wharf gives more than $100 million each year to the university, all told. About $55 million in a base grant, and then in-kind services. So Wharf offers its services to the university free of charge. So if you're a professor who needs patenting, Wharf will do it for free. And that's an in-kind grant, and the value of all of that added up together is about $100 million each year. Yes?
Does the university have to work with Wharf for patenting?
Can you repeat that question?
Yes, the question is, does the university have to work with Wharf for patenting?
Independent, kind of confused.
Yes. So most universities have an Office of Technology Transfer, or they have a foundation that's kind of modeled off of Wharf that is actually much more controlled by the university. And in those cases, every other American university, not every international university, but in the United States, every other university, it's like working for a corporation. When you work for that university, you sign an agreement as part of your employment that you're going to give over your invention. The university owns the patenting rights to anything you invent. That's not the case at Wisconsin. Wisconsin, we presume that the individual inventor owns the rights to their invention. So the university has a policy, it's hard to say this out loud, but yes, the university could decide to create its own tech transfer office if they wanted to. But there's a long-standing agreement with Wharf. Wharf's one of the most successful bodies that does this, that there's an agreement that Wharf is the designated patenting and licensing organization for the university. And so in Steenbock's time, Wharf had to go out and find the professors who had inventions and ask them to give them their patents. That's the way that it works. Now, it's slightly more complicated because, as I mentioned, the Bayh-Dole Act says that federally funded research, you're allowed to patent federally funded research. The university says, in order to make sure that we're fulfilling the obligations of the Bayh-Dole Act, if you have federally funded research, then you are required to work with Wharf. So in that case, yes. Most professors. So the way the policy works in practice is that if you're a professor, a student, or a staff member at University of Wisconsin, you have to disclose an invention to Wharf so that then the university can figure out how much of this is federally funded, how much of this is privately funded, how much is funded by the state, or how much is funded by a private donor. And if they find out that there's no federally funding and there's no contracts involved, then it's up to them to decide if they want to assign to Wharf. So they have to disclose to Wharf. They don't have to assign their rights to Wharf. We do highly recommend that they do that, because if you don't, then you have to go hire your own lawyer. You have to take the risk and the responsibility on yourself. And there have been cases where professors have gone off and done it themselves and end up getting sued for malpractice or had conflict of interest problems that have come up. And so the value that Wharf offers is that, as having 90 years and a staff of 100 professionals who know how to do this stuff, and people like me who talk about it. Other questions? Yes?
There was a famous controversy between Carl Paul Link and Steenbock.
Yes.
And can you tell us something about that?
Sure, yeah. you're leading the witness. Yeah, so as I said, Link was the second big inventor for Wharf. He was a very different personality. Steenbock was this mugwump. Actually, what Carl Paul Link said about Steenbock was that he would walk down the hall with his head so straight you were afraid it's going to fall off. And Carl Paul Link was a much more colorful character. He sponsored the Communist Student Organization. He was we just found an old video we have of where Link pulled his truck up to the Wharf building and was throwing corn cobs at it. Just sort of like having fun. And the Wharf director came out and they were laughing and they were having a lot of fun about it. So he was a much more irreverent personality. And they never really got along. And there was, I think the first dispute they had was that the biochemistry department was trying to figure out how to hire the replacement for Link's advisor. And they had some kind of disagreement, and it sort of, the conversation continued into the men's room, as they say, that they were still arguing back and forth. And eventually Link threatened to punch him. And Steenbock said, "Oh, I will not hesitate to call the police on you." And Link's response was, "Well, I don't care. I'll beat you up in public. I'll drag you out of his bathroom and kick your ass in public." We don't think that there are actually any blows exchanged, but this is the way the story goes. The second one was that Link then later accused Steenbock of convincing the trustees to reject one of his patents. There was Link had invented an anticoagulant, but he also understood the reverse of that. The vitamin K actually coagulates blood, and so he had developed a process to add vitamin K to aspirin so that the danger of internal bleeding in aspirin would be lessened. The trustees had actually tried to patent this, and I think they actually did patent it, but had not been able to find a licensee. And Link was convinced that the reason why this was not successful was because of Steenbock, and so they got into another argument. The way the story goes, Link gave a lecture that was a lecture like this, but instead of talking about his dissertation, he had a piece of butcher paper he unrolled that had all the list of all the things that Steenbock had ever done to him, that sort of like airing grievances. And unlike Steenbock, Link actually had a good relationship with William F. U. So he would like write letters to F. U. and sort of he would be a source. So these would end up in the papers. And so then George Haight, the guy in the bust again, who's a very astute lawyer, he was like the first lawyer to win $1 million judgment by suing the phone company back when it was Ma Bell. They said that George Haight, if he walked into a room of alumni, they would walk out with their checkbooks open. That he was that kind of a persuasive guy. But he had to sort of sort out these personalities. And the way the story goes is they invited Link and Steenbock to the meeting, and then Haight went to the paper and said, "Look, they were both at the same meeting. We talked it out. It was fine, I promise." What had actually happened was that they were both at the same meeting, but I think they had an assistant who walked Steenbock around the building until they knew that Link was gone before they let Steenbock in the building. So they never actually were in the same room at the same time. They were at the same meeting. So yeah, that's the story as I know it. But other questions? Yeah, Tom.
You mentioned the resolution in about 1925 and the Rockefeller and all that. That was also the germination point of the medical school because they were going to build. Do you know, has anybody done the kind of study that you're doing on Steenbock, on that whole era there, the whole thing that we're not going to be tainted by this money and what it did or didn't do for the medical school? Because I think that would be another interesting angle to look at.
So the question was whether somebody's done a history of the Grady Resolution and how that intersected with the creation of the medical school. I don't think there's a thorough history of it. I know that the histories of the University of Wisconsin do talk about it, and they talk about it pretty well, I think. But I don't know. Maybe I'll write that. I don't know. Once I get around to it, that'll be like the fourth book. But so I don't know that they've really gotten into it. I mean, the details of it was the Rockefeller General Education Board had actually provided some money. I think the hospital was already in the process of being built by 1925. I believe the hospital was completed around 1921. So opened in 25. Okay, but they were going to give I think it was a $40,000 grant, and that grant actually had to be canceled because of the Grady Resolution. So this was actually a kind of parallel story to Wharf, and it's something that when I write a little bit more about the beginning of Wharf, I can tell the story in more detail. It is, like I said, it's a counterintuitive thing because at the time you have the regents basically saying we don't want to take any outside money, and then they allow an outside foundation to be created. And so from a certain perspective, you can say Wharf is this nonprofit foundation that William F. U. later criticizes and doesn't like because it's a private foundation. Why is the same guy creating that? And part of it is that they can wash their hands of it. Politically speaking, the university can say, we're not doing patenting. We're not trying to commercialize anything. We're going to let them go off and do that. But yes, it was a donation to, I forget the exact purpose of the grant, but it was a medical school grant that actually got turned down. And then there's a whole back and forth over the course of 10 years in which the university says, well, okay, wait a minute, not every foundation, just the Rockefellers. And then it gets repealed in like 3 years because it's such a, like this is a time when it's right after World War I. Universities are trying to figure out, unlike World War II, after World War II, the government keeps giving universities money. They started funding universities for military research, but after the war is over, they maintain that level and actually exponentially increase it because of the competition with the Soviet Union. After World War I, that all goes away. They started funding a lot of research during the war, and then it goes away. So universities are in a situation where they're trying to find other sources of revenue. And Wharf, part of that story, one of the reasons why Schlichter and Russell hear this Quaker Oats offer and just jump on it is because they're trying to figure out how do we keep up, how do we have a public university keep up with a private foundation, with a privately endowed university like a Yale, like the Ivy League, like the University of Chicago. How do we keep up with them? And Russell grabs onto Wharf as, well, maybe this is an opportunity. And so you have the trustees then saying, we're not going to take any Rockefeller money. It doesn't work in practice. And if you can imagine universities operating now.
You meant the regents rather than the trustees. I just want to clarify that because that's UW regents that.
Yes, sorry.
Because Wharf people are called trustees.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't catch that myself. I just slipped. But yeah, so yeah, the regents. This regents passing this resolution at the same time that the administrators know we're going to need this money. And so in practice, it doesn't really go, it's more of a political controversy than, other than that one initial, rejecting that initial grant, it doesn't have much effect. Other questions? Yeah, sorry, over there.
Work provides mainly an administrative functionality, okay? Do they provide any directive control of the grants after they are issued?
So the question was Wharf provide, so administrative function, you mean administrating the patents?
Basically, with the patents, with whatever they have to do with the money coming in, that's separate from the actual work that's being done with the money.
So the question is, does Wharf have any control over how the grants are administered within the university? So the tradition is no, and I think that's true. I think it's never as clean as you want. What George Haight said was, we take the check up to the board of the university, drop it off, and then run away. The way Harry Russell put it was the Wharf makes the money, the professors decide how to spend it. And that's true in practice. Like Wharf doesn't decide what the grant is. The Vice Chancellor of Research and Graduate Education comes to a Wharf board meeting and says, here's how much money we want, here's what we want for it. And the trustees decide based off of the size of the endowment and their financial longevity, if they can afford that and what they want to give. And sometimes they actually give more, like they that kind of thing. So like in order for the grants to be effective, you do need some dialogue. Like that's what's kind of happened in practice, is you do want to say, so Wharf has kind of said things like, we want to make sure you're spending this money on things that are effective. We don't want you to, this is actually one place where Steenbock disagreed with the trustees. He thought that Wharf should exert more control. He said, we don't want to spend it on professors who have already gone to seed. We want you to spend it on the young professors. And he's a high-minded guy. He basically wants people like him to get the money, right? Every professor kind of thinks that way. Wharf knew that was politically not sustainable. There's a reason why, and the Chancellor was first put on the board in 2001. Before that, the university had no formal connection to the foundation, and they wanted that because they didn't want the foundation being drawn into political conflicts on campus, or political in the sense of people arguing over where the money should go, the way that administrations tend to happen. In fact, one of the reasons why when Steenbock said, I don't want your money, but I do want veto power, the reason why Haight and the other trustees had no interest in that was they did not want Steenbock having veto power. They said, we'll happily give you money, but we want to be able to make our own decisions. We want to be able to do this on ourselves. We don't want professors telling us that, the Link story is actually an example of that. Link was convinced that Steenbock had submarined his invention, and the trustees are like, we want to make business decisions based off of what is good business and what is bad business, and we want them to decide what's good research and not good research. And I think that generally works pretty well, and it has generally traditionally been actually true. So there have actually been times, I'm babbling, answering more than you asked now, but I think there have been times when the universities actually wanted more Wharf involvement and wanted Wharf to more direction, and kind of wanted, we'll say things like, how do we use Wharf money to create more patentable material and things like that. And Wharf has been like, that's not really what we're trying to do here. We want to fund basic research. So, yeah, times change. Any other questions? Yes, Dave.
It's not really a question, but I was just a comment. Since you mentioned footage, I was just going to mention that there was a film made on campus between 1929 and 1931. It's called On to Wisconsin. It was essentially made to promote the university. And the University Archives has put some clips of it on YouTube, not the whole thing, but there are short clips of Harry Steenbock working with rats in his lab, and short clip of Babcock, which is one reason we know it wasn't really made in 1929 because he didn't die until 1931. But,
Yeah.
So if you go to YouTube and put in University of Wisconsin 1929, you can see those clips. And so there's a short clip of Steenbock and a short clip of Babcock and one of Burge and so on. Sort of, so it's around this time period. It's sort of fun to see them.
Great, yeah. So to repeat that for the viewers, there's a YouTube videos. If you Google University of Wisconsin 1929, there are video clips of a film made at the time to promote the University of Wisconsin that will show Babcock and Steenbock in the lab. I think some of the pictures that I used are actually stills or from that same time. They may not be stills from the picture, but the photographer that did the same thing, yeah. So yeah.
Correct me if I'm wrong, is there not audio of Babcock speaking on that?
It's a silent film. There's not audio.
I guess I was wrong.
I think I have heard his voice though. I think there is an audio recording somewhere.
Okay. I thought I heard one before also.
Yeah.
Other questions? If not, thank you very much.